Hello to my wonderful family and welcome back to our channel. It's always a joy to have you here with us. Today, we're diving into a story about the walls we build and the unexpected people who teach us how to tear them down. It's about how the smallest gesture can create the biggest change, and how sometimes you have to see your own life through a stranger's eyes to truly understand what's important. From across the gleaming ballroom floor, billionaire Arthur Vance watched a waitress kneel before his disabled son. And with 4 simple words, she began to dismantle a lifetime of gilded armor he didn't even know he was wearing. The first sound in Arthur Vance's world was silence. It was a thick, expensive silence, woven into the very fabric of the penthouse that floated 37 floors above the ceaseless thrum of the city. It was the silence of triple-paned glass, of staff who moved on soft-soled shoes, of a life so meticulously curated that it produced no friction, no unwanted noise. At 7:03 a.m., the silence was punctuated by the soft chime of his tablet. Arthur was already dressed in a bespoke suit, the grey fabric a perfect match for the morning mist clinging to the skyline. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling window, not admiring the view, but assessing it, as if he could command the clouds to part through sheer force of will. The tablet displayed Leo's schedule. 7 a.m., wake, dress, assisted by Nurse Holloway. 7:30 a.m., breakfast, nutrient-optimized smoothie, Formula A7. 8 a.m. to 9:30 a.m., physical therapy with Dr. Anya Sharma. 9:30 a.m. to 11 a.m., cognitive enrichment, auditory program, Module 4. It was a life planned to the minute, a fortress of routine built to manage, to optimize, to control. Arthur scrolled down, his thumb moving with brisk efficiency. 7 p.m., Vance Foundation Charity Gala. A small figure appeared in the reflection of the glass. Leo. His 10-year-old son stood in the doorway, dressed in a soft cashmere sweater and trousers. His left side was weaker than his right, a lingering shadow of a traumatic birth. He walked with a pronounced limp, his left arm held close to his body. On his feet were orthopedic shoes, clunky and functional, a stark contrast to the polished marble floor. "Good morning, Leo," Arthur said, turning. His voice was pleasant, but it held the same crisp, boardroom tone he used with his executive team. He didn't move to hug him. He hadn't in years. Touch was complicated. It was a reminder of fragility, of the imperfections he spent every waking moment trying to manage away. Leo offered a small, shy smile. In his right hand, he clutched a small, worn MP3 player, its white headphones dangling. It was his only rebellion, a small world of sound that was entirely his own. He looked past his father, toward the sprawling city below. There was a quiet longing in his eyes, a curiosity that no scheduled module could ever satisfy. Dr. Sharma arrived at precisely 8 a.m. She was a woman with kind eyes and a firm, professional demeanor that Arthur appreciated. His showing remarkable progress with the new proprioceptive exercises. "Mr. Vance," she said, her hands gently guiding Leo through a series of stretches on a large mat. "His core stability is improving." "Excellent," Arthur said, nodding. He wasn't watching his son's face, which was screwed up in concentration. He was watching the angle of his leg, the degree of improvement, the data. He loved his son with a fierce, desperate intensity, but it was the love of an engineer for a flawed, infinitely complex project. He would give Leo the best of everything, the best doctors, the best technology, the best life money could buy. He would build a world so perfect for him that no one would ever see the cracks. He didn't realize he was building a cage. 40 blocks south and a universe away. The only silence in Lena's world was the split second after a plate shattered on the floor. The Liberty Diner was a symphony of glorious noise. The hiss of the grill, the clatter of ceramic on formica, the booming laughter of Ul, the cook, and the constant, overlapping chatter of a dozen different conversations. Lena moved through it all like a dancer. At 4:45 p.m., she was a blur of efficient grace. "Here you go, honey," she said, sliding a plate of pancakes in front of a wide-eyed little girl. "Extra chocolate chips, just how you like it." She refilled the coffee of Mr. Henderson, a retired postal worker who had been sitting in the same booth every afternoon for 20 years. How's the crossword treating you today, George? It's a 7-letter word for stubborn, and I was about to write your name in, he grumbled, a twinkle in his eye. Lena laughed, a warm, genuine sound that made heads turn. She had a face that was made for smiling, her eyes crinkling at the corners. She was tired. This was the end of an 8-hour shift, and in less than an hour, she had to be at the Hemlock Club for a 5-hour catering gig. The rent wasn't going to pay itself, but the fatigue never seemed to touch the core of her, the part that saw every person in her orbit as a story, not an order. She had a soft spot for the quiet ones. The university student huddled in the corner, nursing a single cup of tea for 2 hours, his textbook open but his eyes staring into space. She'd slide him a complimentary slice of pie. Brain food, she'd whisper with a wink. Her empathy was a reflex, honed by a life that had demanded it. She'd been the one to care for her younger brother when his asthma was bad, the one who could calm him down just by breathing with him. She learned early that what people showed on the outside was rarely the whole story. You had to look for the spaces in between, the hesitations, the things their eyes said when their mouths were silent. She glanced at the clock. 4:52 p.m. Time to go. She untied her apron, revealing the crisp black uniform she wore for her second job. Big night, Lena. Ul called from the grill. Charity gala at the Hemlock Club, she said, grabbing her worn coat. Gonna go watch the rich folks save the world one canapé at a time. He chuckled. Don't let 'em get to you. They never do, she said, though it wasn't entirely true. She'd seen the casual cruelty of the very wealthy, the way they could look right through you, their entitlement a thick, invisible shield. She tried not to let it harden her, but sometimes it left a little chill behind. She stepped out into the crisp evening air, the city lights just beginning to glitter. She pulled her coat tighter and walked toward the bus stop, a lone figure heading from a world of warm, grease-a-spoon authenticity into one of cold, polished opulence. The Hemlock Club was breathtaking, a cavernous ballroom with ceilings that soared 3 stories high, from which hung chandeliers that dripped diamonds of light. A string orchestra played softly in the corner, their music a silken carpet for the gentle murmur of 100 conversations. Men in tuxedos and women in shimmering gowns drifted through the room like elegant fish in a well-lit aquarium. Arthur Vance was in his element. He moved with an easy, understated authority, a glass of mineral water in his hand. He greeted a senator, shared a curt nod with a rival CEO, and exchanged pleasantries with the host. He was a pillar of this world, respected, admired, and slightly feared. By his side, clutching his father's hand, was Leo. He was wearing a perfectly tailored little tuxedo, his unruly hair tamed with a touch of gel. But his eyes were wide, overwhelmed by the scale of it all. The noise here wasn't the warm chaos of a diner. It was a layered, formal hum that made him feel small. He clung to his MP3 player in his pocket, his thumb hovering over the play button, a desperate need for the familiar. Arthur felt the boy's hand tremble in his. "Stay close," he murmured, his voice low. It was meant to be reassuring, but it sounded like an order. He steered Leo toward a quiet alcove, away from the main flow of traffic. It was a tactical move, designed to keep Leo from being jostled or, worse, from being the subject of pitying glances. Arthur couldn't bear those glances. They felt like a verdict on his own failure. Meanwhile, Lena slipped through a service door, a heavy tray of champagne flutes balanced expertly on one hand. She scanned the room, her eyes taking in the glittering spectacle with a practiced, detached professionalism. Her job was to be invisible, to anticipate a need before it was voiced, to be a ghost in a black dress. But Lena was not a ghost. She saw everything. She saw the woman whose smile didn't reach her eyes as she talked to her husband. She saw the young man who kept checking his phone under the table, his jaw tight with anxiety. And from across the room, she saw a little boy in a tuxedo, standing half-hidden in an alcove, his small frame radiating a loneliness so profound it was almost a sound. He wasn't looking at the glittering crowd. He was watching the orchestra, his head tilted, a look of pure, unadulterated wonder on his face. Arthur was deep in conversation with a board member, discussing endowment strategies. He had momentarily turned his back on the alcove, confident that Leo was safe, contained. Leo took a half-step out of the shadows, drawn by the swelling melody of the strings. He saw Lena. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second across the sea of glitter and glamour. She was just another person in a uniform, someone he was taught not to bother. But she wasn't looking at him with pity. She wasn't looking at him with the strained, overly bright smile that so many adults used. She was just seeing him. And in her eyes, he saw a flicker of the same warmth he felt when he listened to his favorite song. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile before turning away to offer a glass to a guest. The moment was gone. But for Leo, it was the first authentic human connection he'd made all night. And for Lena, the image of the lonely little boy with the hungry eyes was logged away, stored in that empathetic heart of hers, waiting for the music to swell again. The pieces were in place. The silence was about to be broken. Before we see what happens next, I have to ask, have you ever seen a small act of kindness completely change the atmosphere in a room? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your story. An hour bled into the next. The air in the ballroom grew warmer, thick with perfume and the low, constant vibration of wealth. Arthur had successfully navigated 3 separate conversations about market futures and philanthropic tax benefits. He operated with a detached precision, his mind a finely tuned machine processing data points and social cues. Yet, a part of his awareness remained tethered to the alcove, a low-grade hum of anxiety he refused to acknowledge. He had provided Leo with a tablet, loaded with a pre-approved, educational game. It was a digital pacifier, and it was supposed to work. But Leo wasn't looking at the screen. The tablet lay forgotten on the velvet seat beside him. His entire being was oriented towards the orchestra. They had transitioned from gentle, atmospheric strings to a more soulful, jazzy melody with a soft, persistent beat. It was a song that invited movement, a gentle sway, a tap of the foot. Leo's right foot, the one in the sleek black dress shoe, tapped almost imperceptibly against the marble floor. His body was still, but his spirit was dancing. He was a boy locked outside a candy store, his nose pressed against the glass. Lena, moving through the room with her tray, noticed. Each time her circuitous route brought her past the alcove, she saw the same thing. The boy, the tablet, and the longing. It was the longing that snagged her attention every time. It was a familiar ache she recognized from her own childhood, from watching other kids go on field trips she couldn't afford, from the quiet wish for something just beyond her reach. Most of the guests here tonight had never felt that kind of longing. They were people who simply acquired what they wanted. But this boy, dressed in clothes that cost more than her monthly rent, was consumed by it. She saw Arthur across the room, his back to his son, a silhouette of power and importance. She saw the other guests, all lost in their own orbits. No one was watching the boy. No one but her. A quiet debate sparked within her. It's not your place. You'll get in trouble. Don't get involved. But then she looked back at Leo, at the subtle, rhythmic tap of his shoe, and a different voice, a warmer and more insistent one, took over. He's just a kid. And kids deserve to dance. Her tray was empty. Her supervisor was on the other side of the vast room. This was her chance. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she set her empty tray on a nearby serving stand and straightened her dress. She felt a nervous flutter in her stomach, but she walked forward, her steps deliberate, her focus entirely on the small figure in the alcove. She stopped just at the edge of his small sanctuary. Leo looked up at her, his eyes widening in surprise. He recognized her. The lady with the kind smile. He instinctively clutched the MP3 player in his pocket, a nervous habit. Lena didn't loom over him. She did something that shifted the power dynamic of the entire room, even if only for the two of them. She slowly sank to her knees, her black dress pooling around her on the cool marble. Now, they were at eye level. The glittering, adult world vanished, and all that existed was the space between them. She leaned in slightly, her voice barely a whisper, a conspiratorial secret just for him. Soft enough not to be swallowed by the music but gentle enough not to startle. I love this song, she said, her eyes warm and sincere. But I have a secret. Leo's curiosity piqued. He tilted his head. I don't really know how to dance to it, she confessed, a look of playful helplessness on her face. She wasn't pitying him. She was asking for his help. She looked at his tapping foot. But it looks like you do. She paused, letting the invitation settle in the air between them. Could you show me a step? Those 4 words. Could you show me? For a boy whose entire life was a series of instructions, of being shown, of being corrected and guided and managed, the request was a revelation. It was a transfer of power. She wasn't offering to help him. She was asking him to help her. Leo's breath hitched. He glanced over his shoulder, a reflexive check for his father. Arthur was still engrossed, a stone statue of authority. He looked back at Lena, at her open, expectant face. There was no judgment there, no clinical assessment, just a simple, human request. He hesitated for a heartbeat, the ingrained caution warring with a powerful, burgeoning desire. Then, slowly, tentatively, he made his choice. He let go of the MP3 player in his pocket. He took a small, shuffling step forward with his right foot, then brought his left foot to meet it. It was a simple, clumsy weight shift, the kind a child makes when first learning to feel a rhythm. He swayed slightly, his shoulders rising and falling with the movement. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't polished. But it was his. Lena's face broke into a radiant smile. It was pure, unadulterated delight. Oh, like this? She whispered. She perfectly mirrored his shuffle, her body mimicking his exact movement with a quiet grace. She didn't try to improve it or embellish it. She honored it. Leo watched her, a look of astonishment on his face. He did it again, a little bolder this time. Shuffle, sway. She shuffled and swayed right along with him. A tiny giggle escaped his lips, a sound as rare and precious as a falling star. For the next 20 seconds, they were in a world of their own. A 10-year-old boy in a tuxedo and a waitress in a black dress, dancing in an alcove while a universe of wealth swirled around them, completely oblivious. The shame that usually clung to Leo's movements, the self-consciousness about his limp, all of it melted away under the warmth of her acceptance. He shuffled his feet, and she shuffled hers. He raised his right hand, wiggling his fingers to the music, and she raised hers, too. And then it happened. A smile bloomed on Leo's face. It wasn't his usual shy, fleeting smile. This was a supernova of a smile, a blast of pure, uninhibited joy that lit him up from the inside out. It was the smile of a boy who, for the first time, felt not just seen, but celebrated. It was at that exact moment that Arthur Vance concluded his conversation. He turned, a platitude about synergistic goals dying on his lips. His eyes scanned the alcove, expecting to see his son silently absorbed in the tablet. But that is not what he saw. The world tilted. The ambient sound of the gala, the music, the chatter, the clinking of glasses, faded into a dull, distant roar, like blood rushing in his ears. All he could see, as if through a pinhole lens, was the scene in the alcove. He saw a woman, a waitress, on her knees on the floor. And he saw his son. His son was dancing. No, not just dancing. He was leading. And he was smiling. That smile. Arthur had never seen that smile before. He had seen Leo happy, in a quiet, contained way. He had seen him pleased. But he had never, not once in 10 years, seen this kind of unharnessed, radiant bliss. It was a joy so pure it was almost violent. And a stranger, a woman in a service uniform, had summoned it with impossible ease. Arthur's hand, holding the glass of mineral water, tightened. The crystal creaked under the pressure. A tidal wave of emotions crashed over him, a chaotic, contradictory storm. First, there was a primal surge of shock and rage. Who is she? What is she doing? How dare she touch him? It was the protective instinct of a father, twisted into a possessive, territorial fury. Then, swift and sharp, came the sting of jealousy. It was a cold, bitter poison that spread through his veins. He, Arthur Vance, with his billions, with his team of world-class specialists, with his meticulously planned schedules and nutrient-optimized smoothies, had never been able to elicit that smile. He had tried to build a perfect world for his son, and all he had created was a beautiful, silent prison. This woman, with nothing but a simple question, had set him free in 20 seconds. And beneath it all, coiling in the pit of his stomach, was shame. A deep, profound shame that was suddenly, brutally illuminated. He saw his son's disability not as a clinical condition to be managed, but as a public spectacle. And worse, he saw his own gaping failure as a father. This moment of pure connection wasn't happening with him. He was the bystander, the outsider. A stranger was on the floor with his son, while he stood 30 feet away, talking about money. The glass in his hand felt impossibly heavy. The music swelled, but Arthur couldn't hear it. He could only see the light on his son's face, a light he had not kindled, a light he now desperately, angrily, wanted to extinguish before it burned him to ashes. A single, painful thought pierced through the storm. She made him happier than I ever have. And that thought, more than anything else, was unbearable. The bomb had landed. The fallout was just beginning. The 20 seconds of joy shattered the instant Arthur began to move. He didn't stride. He sliced through the crowd, a shark cutting through water. The polite smiles of the guests he passed faltered, catching a glimpse of the cold fury in his eyes. The warm bubble of music and laughter that surrounded the ballroom didn't penetrate the icy space he now occupied. Lena felt the shift in atmosphere before she saw him. It was a sudden drop in temperature, a prickling on the back of her neck. She looked up from Leo's beaming face and saw a man in a tuxedo bearing down on them. His face was a mask of controlled rage, his jaw so tight it looked like it was carved from granite. The supernova smile on Leo's face collapsed into a tiny, flickering ember. He saw his father, and the familiar weight of the world settled back onto his small shoulders. He froze, his hand dropping to his side, the brief, beautiful dance instantly forgotten, replaced by a wave of confusion and fear. He had been happy. Why did his father look so angry? Arthur reached the alcove. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice, when it came, was low and sharp, each word a shard of ice. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked, his gaze fixed on Lena, completely ignoring his son. Lena was still on her knees. She felt a flush of heat rise up her neck. She had been caught. The fear of being reprimanded, of losing her job, was real and immediate. But it was quickly overshadowed by a surge of defensive anger. This man wasn't just questioning her actions. He was looking at her like she was a piece of dirt he'd found on his shoe. She rose slowly to her feet, trying to reclaim some semblance of dignity. We were just dancing," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. He was enjoying the music. Arthur's eyes were merciless. "My son does not require your entertainment." The word entertainment was delivered with a dismissive curl of his lip, as if she had been performing a cheap party trick. He scanned her from head to toe, the simple black dress, the sensible shoes, the earnest expression on her face, and dismissed her entirely. "I wasn't entertaining him," Lena shot back, her own pride stung. "I was dancing with him. There's a difference." "The distinction is irrelevant," Arthur said, his voice dropping even lower. He took a deliberate step forward, forcing her to take a half step back. It was a subtle, powerful assertion of dominance. "You are here to serve champagne, not to engage with the guests. And certainly not with my son." He finally looked at Leo, but his expression didn't soften. He placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder. The touch wasn't gentle. It was proprietary. It was a reclaiming of property. "Leo," he said, his tone clipped. "Come." Leo looked from his father's stone-cold face to Lena's, which was now a mixture of hurt and indignation. He wanted to say something, to explain that she was nice, that he had asked her, in his own way. But the words wouldn't come. His father's anger was a wall of sound, silencing everything else. He allowed himself to be steered away, casting one last, apologetic glance at the waitress. Arthur paused and looked back at Lena. A new, uglier thought had taken root in his mind, a justification for his rage. She must have wanted something. People like her always wanted something. "We don't need your pity," he said, his voice laced with venom. "And we certainly don't need your help." That was the line that broke through Lena's professionalism. Pity? She hadn't felt a shred of pity. She had felt a connection. She had seen joy. This man was so cocooned in his own wealth and misery that he couldn't recognize a simple, genuine human gesture. He saw everything as a transaction. "You're right," she said, her voice now as cold as his. "You don't need my help." She looked past him, at Leo's small, retreating back. But he deserved that smile. "And for the life of me, I can't imagine why that would make you so angry." Arthur's jaw tightened even further. Her words were a direct hit, striking the raw nerve of shame he was so desperately trying to hide. She had seen it. She had seen his failure, and she had just named it out loud. For a fleeting second, her perception terrified him. He masked it instantly with more anger. Without another word, he turned his back on her and guided Leo away, disappearing into the glittering crowd. Lena stood alone in the alcove, her heart hammering in her chest. The warmth of the dance had been completely leached away, replaced by a bitter, familiar chill. This was why she kept her guard up. This was the arrogance Ull had warned her about. The casual cruelty of a man who had everything and valued nothing. All her worst assumptions about people like Arthur Vance were confirmed in that brutal, 3-minute exchange. She felt foolish for her moment of spontaneity, for thinking she could bridge the gap between their worlds with a simple dance. She had been naive. She had been put back in her place. She took a shaky breath, smoothed down her dress, and walked back towards the service area, her face a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. But inside, she was replaying his words. "We don't need your pity." The injustice of it burned. Across the room, Arthur settled Leo back onto the velvet seat. He thrust the tablet into his son's hands. "Play your game," he commanded, his voice tight. Leo looked up at his father, his lower lip trembling. The joy was gone. The light was gone. All that remained was the familiar, heavy silence between them. He looked at the tablet screen, at the bright, meaningless colors of the game. He didn't want the game. He wanted the music. He wanted the lady with the kind eyes. Arthur stood over him, a sentry guarding a prison of his own making. But he wasn't looking at Leo. He was staring out at the ballroom, his eyes unfocused. He had won the confrontation. He had re-established control. He had put the waitress in her place. So why did he feel so hollow? The image of Leo's smile, that brilliant, supernova smile, was burned onto the inside of his eyelids. Every time he blinked, he saw it. And every time he saw it, he heard Lena's voice, sharp and clear. He deserved that smile. He resisted it. He tried to smother the image with rationalizations. She was an opportunist. She was unprofessional. She was a threat. He tried to reframe the memory, to repaint her as the villain and himself as the protective father. He told himself he had done the right thing. But the memory wouldn't be tamed. It was a wild thing, beautiful and terrifying, and it had been set loose inside his meticulously ordered mind. The image of his son's joy, and the undeniable fact that he had been the one to destroy it, began to gnaw at him. He had spent 10 years building walls to protect his son, to protect himself. But as he stood there, surrounded by all the trappings of his success, he had the sickening feeling that he had built them all on the wrong side. He had locked himself in, and left his son on the outside, peering in. The resistance was his last line of defense, but the foundations were cracking. The carefully constructed silence of his world had been broken, and the echo of a little boy's laugh and a woman's quiet question refused to fade. The gala began to wind down. The orchestra played its final number, a gentle, melancholic waltz that seemed to mourn the evening's end. Guests started to retrieve their coats, their laughter and conversation echoing in the grand foyer as they waited for their drivers to pull up to the canopied entrance. Arthur, having collected Leo's small coat, was among the first to leave. He wanted out. The air in the ballroom felt thin and suffocating, the memory of the encounter in the alcove clinging to him like a shroud. Leo was quiet beside him, his small hand lost in Arthur's. He hadn't said a word since the confrontation. He had simply retreated into himself, a place where Arthur's cold anger couldn't reach him. As they stepped outside, they were met not by the crisp night air, but by a wall of wind and water. A storm, which had been a distant threat on the horizon, had descended upon the city with sudden, brutal force. Rain lashed down in thick, wind-driven sheets, turning the street into a dark, rushing river. A flash of lightning bleached the sky white, followed an instant later by a deafening crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Leo flinched, pressing himself against his father's leg. Valets scrambled to hold the club's large umbrellas against the gale, but it was a losing battle. The line of black cars was at a standstill, their headlights cutting hazy cones into the deluge. "What's the delay?" Arthur demanded of the head valet, his voice sharp with impatience. "The roads are flooding, sir," the man shouted over the roar of the storm. A transformer blew a block away. "The whole street is blocked off. Nothing's getting in or out right now." Arthur felt a surge of frustration. It was a feeling he loathed, the feeling of being powerless. He, a man who could bend markets to his will, was being held hostage by the weather. He looked down at Leo, who was shivering, whether from the cold or fear, he couldn't tell. "We'll wait inside," he snapped, turning on his heel and marching back into the relative quiet of the club's foyer. A small cluster of remaining guests huddled there, murmuring and checking their phones, their expressions a mixture of annoyance and unease. It was then that the lights flickered once, twice, and died. A collective gasp went through the foyer. The only illumination now came from the frantic, strobing flashes of lightning outside. In one of those flashes, Arthur saw a face across the room that made his stomach clench. It was Lena. She had been part of a small crew of catering staff tasked with the final cleanup. They were trapped, just like the guests. She stood near a service hallway, her worn coat on, her shift over, but with nowhere to go. Her expression was weary, her shoulders slumped. In the flickering darkness, stripped of the ballroom's glamour, she looked younger, more vulnerable. Their eyes met for a brief, charged moment in the gloom before the darkness swallowed them again. The space between them crackled with unspoken animosity. A moment later, a club manager appeared with a large candelabra, its flames casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the inconvenience," he announced, his voice straining to sound calm. "It seems we've lost power. We have a backup generator for the essential systems, but for now, we recommend you make yourselves comfortable in the West Lounge. We'll have coffee and refreshments brought there." The West Lounge was a smaller, more intimate space, paneled in dark wood and filled with plush leather armchairs and sofas arranged around a grand, unlit fireplace. It was a room designed for quiet conversations and expensive brandy. Now, it was becoming an unlikely sanctuary for a motley crew of stranded millionaires and a handful of service staff. The social hierarchy of the evening had been scrambled by the storm. Arthur found a secluded corner, settling Leo into a deep armchair before taking a seat opposite him. He wanted to maintain his distance, to remain an island of controlled silence in the midst of this chaotic turn of events. But the room was too small, the circumstances too intimate. Lena and a few of her colleagues entered the lounge, their unease palpable. They were in a strange limbo, no longer staff, but not quite guests. They huddled together near the door, speaking in low whispers, unsure of the protocol. The club manager, seeing them, gestured them in. "Please, come in, find a seat. No point in standing in the hallway." Reluctantly, they dispersed, finding seats on the periphery of the room. Lena chose a small, stiff-backed chair near the grand windows, as far from Arthur's corner as she could get. She stared out at the storm, watching the rain beat a frantic rhythm against the thick glass, preferring the chaos outside to the suffocating tension inside. The forced proximity was excruciating. Every time Arthur shifted in his chair, he was aware of her presence. Every time she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, it seemed to happen in his peripheral vision. They were two magnets, turned to repel, yet forced into the same small box. The air between them was thick with the memory of his harsh words and her defiant glare. Leo, however, was not bound by the same animosity. He was a child, and his world was simpler. He saw the lady from the dance. He remembered her kindness, not his father's anger. From the depths of his armchair, he watched her. He saw her shiver slightly, rubbing her arms to ward off the chill seeping from the large windows. Without a word, he slipped off his chair. Arthur, lost in his own brooding thoughts, didn't notice at first. Leo walked, with his careful, limping gait, across the dimly lit room. He approached the chair where Lena was sitting. She looked down, startled, as a small figure appeared beside her. It was the boy. His face was solemn, his eyes full of a quiet intensity. He didn't say anything. He simply held out his tuxedo jacket, the one his father had made him take off inside. It was a small, formal, ridiculously expensive garment. And he was offering it to her. Lena stared at him, then at the jacket. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a gesture of such pure, unprompted sweetness that it completely disarmed her. The anger and resentment she had been nursing towards his father melted away in that instant, replaced by a wave of overwhelming tenderness for this little boy. "Oh, honey," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You'll be cold." Leo just pushed the jacket a little further towards her. His meaning was clear. "You're cold. Take it." Across the room, Arthur finally looked up from his stupor. He saw his son standing beside the waitress. He saw Leo offering her his jacket. His first instinct was a familiar flash of irritation. But it was different this time. The anger was muted, confused. He saw the scene not as a breach of protocol, but through a different lens. He saw his son performing an act of pure, unselfish chivalry. An act Arthur himself would never have thought to perform. Leo wasn't just being managed anymore. He was acting on his own, with his own agency, his own empathy. Lena reached out and gently placed her hand over Leo's on the jacket. Her touch was warm. "Thank you," she said softly, looking directly into his eyes. "That's the kindest thing anyone has done for me all night." She didn't take the jacket. Instead, she patted the arm of her chair. "But I have a better idea. Why don't you come sit here with me? We can share the warmth from the window lightning." She'd turned his offer into an invitation for them to conspire against the cold together. Leo's face brightened. He looked over at his father, a silent question in his eyes. Arthur was frozen. The entire room seemed to have faded away. It was just the three of them, caught in this strange, candlelit tableau. He saw the hope on his son's face. He saw the genuine warmth on Lena's. He remembered her words, sharp and accusatory. He deserved that smile. And here was a chance for another one. To say no would be an act of breathtaking cruelty. To say yes felt like a surrender. It meant acknowledging that this woman, this stranger he had treated so poorly, offered his son something he could not. His pride warred with a new, unfamiliar feeling, a flicker of longing to see his son happy again. He gave a single, barely perceptible nod. It was all Leo needed. A real smile, small but brilliant, lit up his face. He scrambled onto the chair, curling up beside Lena, the tuxedo jacket clutched between them like a shared treasure. Lena, instinctively, pulled the lapels of his own sweater a little closer around his neck, a simple, maternal gesture of care. Arthur watched them, his son and the waitress. They weren't talking. They were just sitting together, watching the storm, two silhouettes against the flashing glass. The space between them was comfortable, easy, natural. It was everything the space between Arthur and his son was not. The hard shell of his resistance began to crack under the gentle pressure of this unexpected, undeniable connection. He was trapped. Not just in this lounge, but in this moment, forced to witness a reality he could no longer deny. In the dark, when all the power and money in the world were useless, the only thing that truly mattered was a little bit of human warmth. And it was happening right in front of him, entirely without his help. He felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if he were the ghost in the room, and they, the waitress and his son, were the only ones who were truly alive. What do you think is harder? Admitting you were wrong to a stranger, or admitting you were wrong to yourself? Share your thoughts. It's a tough one, and I'm curious to see what you think." The West Lounge settled into a strange, suspended reality. The storm raged outside, a wild orchestra of wind and rain, while inside, the flickering candlelight created an atmosphere of forced intimacy. Most of the other guests and staff spoke in hushed tones or were lost in the blue glow of their phones. But in Arthur's corner of the room, a different kind of quiet had fallen. Leo, nestled in the chair beside Lena, had finally succumbed to exhaustion. His small body curled up, his breathing deep and even. His tuxedo jacket was draped over both of them like a makeshift blanket. Lena stared at the sleeping boy, a soft, unconscious smile on her lips. She gently brushed a stray lock of hair from his forehead. It was a simple, thoughtless gesture, but for Arthur, watching from his chair, it was a thunderclap. It was the kind of easy, maternal touch he had only ever seen in photographs of his late wife, Amelia. The sight of it in this stranger, this woman he had so brutally misjudged, sent a complex, painful pang through his chest. The silence between them stretched, no longer hostile, but thick with unspoken questions. Arthur felt an unfamiliar compulsion to fill it, not with commands or business talk, but with something real. He cleared his throat. "He's never done that before," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "Offered someone his coat." Lena's gaze shifted from Leo to Arthur. The candlelight softened the hard lines of his face, revealing a weariness she hadn't seen before. "He's a good kid," she said simply. "He has a kind heart." "Most people don't see that," Arthur admitted, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. "They see the rest of it. The limp, the therapy, the schedules." "Maybe that's because that's what you're showing them," Lena replied. It wasn't an accusation. It was a quiet observation, offered with a gentleness that caught him off guard. She held his gaze. "When you look at him, what do you see?" The question was direct, disarming. He had no boardroom answer for it. He thought for a moment, the flickering flames dancing in his eyes. "I see a problem to be solved. A project to be managed. I see a series of challenges to overcome to ensure he has the best possible life." Lena was quiet for a long moment, processing his words. "I don't think he's a project, Mr. Vance," she said softly. "I think he's a little boy who wanted to dance." She hesitated, then took a small risk. "Why were you so angry about it?" He could have shut her down. The old Arthur would have. A cold stare, a dismissive word. But the old Arthur was a fortress whose walls were crumbling. The image of Leo's joy, followed by the sight of his quiet act of kindness, had done too much damage. "You said it was pity," he said, more to himself than to her. "It wasn't that. Not really." He looked at his hands, large and capable, hands that had built an empire but had forgotten how to hold his own son. "When I saw him smiling with you, I felt rage. Because I realized that all my resources, all my planning, all my money, none of it had ever brought him a moment of joy that pure. And a stranger did it in less than a minute. It felt like a verdict on my entire life. On my failure as a father." The confession hung in the air, raw and exposed. Lena felt a profound shift. The arrogant billionaire was gone. In his place was a man drowning in a private sea of grief and inadequacy. Her own defensiveness vanished, replaced by the familiar pool of empathy. "It wasn't me," she said gently. "I didn't give him that joy. It was already in him. All I did was give it a safe place to come out." She looked down at Leo's sleeping form. "It's easy for me. I learned a long time ago how to look for the person inside the problem." Arthur looked up, intrigued. "What do you mean?" A shadow of memory crossed Lena's face. "I had a younger brother, Daniel," she began, her voice taking on a distant quality. "He had severe asthma. From the time he was a baby, his life was all about puffers, nebulizers, hospital visits. My parents were always so scared, so focused on the next attack, on managing his breathing. They loved him, but they loved him with a sense of panic." She paused, remembering. "But I wasn't the parent. I was his sister. I just saw Danny. I saw the kid who loved drawing superheroes and telling terrible jokes. When he'd have an attack, He'd get so scared, and that would make it worse. I learned to just sit with him, breathe with him, and start talking about what his latest superhero, Captain Wheeze-Begone, was going to do that day. I'd make him the hero of his own story. It would make him forget to be scared. He wasn't his illness. He was just Danny. She looked at Arthur, her eyes full of a deep, sorrowful wisdom. Daniel passed away when he was 15. A complication. But in his 15 years, he lived. He wasn't a project. He was my brother. The story settled in the space between them, a quiet, heartbreaking gift of understanding. Arthur finally understood. Her kindness to Leo wasn't an act. It wasn't pity. It was a reflex born from love and loss. It was her native language. And her vulnerability opened a door in him that had been sealed shut for a decade. He felt a burning need to answer her honesty with his own. My wife's name was Amelia, he said, the name feeling strange and holy in the quiet room. He hadn't spoken it aloud to a stranger in years. She and Leo, they are inextricably linked in my mind, he continued, his voice growing thick. The birth was difficult. There were complications. An amniotic embolism. It was rare, aggressive. One moment she was holding my hand. The next, the room was full of alarms. He stared into the flickering candle flame, but he was seeing a sterile, white hospital room. They saved Leo. They brought him out, this tiny, fragile thing, and rushed him to the NICU. And in the other room, they lost her. She never got to hold him. I was a father and a widower in the same hour. He finally looked at Lena, and his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. The mask was gone. All that was left was the man, shattered by a decade-old grief. For the longest time, I couldn't even look at him without feeling the phantom pain of her absence. His every struggle, his every doctor's appointment, was a reminder of what that day cost me. It's not his fault. God, I know it's not his fault. But I've been punishing him for it ever since. I've been managing him, keeping him safe, keeping him contained. Because I was terrified. Terrified that if I let myself love him without reservation, I would lose him too. And I couldn't survive that. It's easier to manage a project. A project can't break your heart. The confession, a decade of buried pain, lay bare between them. Lena didn't speak. She just listened, her presence a silent, steady anchor in his storm. She saw the whole story now, the coldness, the control, the anger at the dance. It was all a complicated, tragic shield for a heart broken in the most unimaginable way. When he finished, a single tear escaped and traced a path down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. Lena reached out, not to touch him, but just a small, hesitant gesture into the space between them. "I'm so sorry, Arthur," she whispered, using his first name for the first time. It sounded natural, right? That was all she said. There was no cheap comfort, no empty platitudes. Just a simple, profound acknowledgement of his pain. And it was exactly what he needed. In the aftermath of their shared confessions, the atmosphere in the lounge transformed. The tension had evaporated, replaced by a fragile, tentative peace. They were no longer a billionaire and a waitress. They were Arthur, a grieving man who had forgotten how to love, and Lena, a compassionate woman who had never forgotten how. They began to talk, their voices low, a secret thread of conversation in the dim light. The topics drifted away from the heavy weight of the past. She told him about the absurdities of the diner, about Mr. Henderson and his crosswords, about all the cook's belief that he could communicate with pigeons. She spoke of her dream to one day open a small community arts center for kids, a place where any child, regardless of their family's income, could come and paint or sing or dance. Arthur found himself smiling. A real, unforced smile. He listened, captivated by the warmth and color of her world, so different from his own sterile landscape of stock prices and board meetings. In turn, he found himself sharing things he hadn't thought about in years. He told her about a backpacking trip through Spain he'd taken with Amelia before the money, before the empire. He described the taste of cheap wine and the feeling of sleeping under the stars. He spoke of his late wife not as a tragedy, but as the vibrant, laughing woman she had been. She would have loved Leo's dance, he said quietly, a look of pained wonder on his face. She would have been the first one on the floor with him. She'd be proud of him, Lena affirmed gently. And she'd be proud of the man who is learning to see his son again. At some point, Leo stirred. He blinked sleepily, looking at his father and then at Lena. He saw them talking, saw the softness in his father's eyes, the gentle smile on Lena's face. The fear and confusion were gone from his own expression, replaced by a sense of calm. He sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Did I sleep long?" he asked, his voice drowsy. "Just a little while, champ," Arthur said, his voice imbued with a new warmth that made Leo look at him in surprise. "I'm hungry," Leo announced. Before Arthur could signal a manager, Lena stood up. "I think I can solve that problem." She gave them a conspiratorial wink and disappeared towards the service corridor. A few minutes later, she returned, not with fancy canapes, but with 3 glasses of milk and a plate piled high with chocolate chip cookies, clearly liberated from the club's kitchen stores. "The chef owes me a favor," she said, setting the plate down on the small table between them. Leo's eyes went wide with delight. Cookies were a strictly controlled substance in his nutrient-optimized world. He looked at his father for permission. Arthur met Lena's sparkling eyes over the plate of forbidden treats. For the first time, he saw a choice not between correct and incorrect, but between control and joy. He picked up a cookie. "I think we can make an exception tonight," he said, and took a bite. A huge grin spread across Leo's face. The 3 of them sat there, in the candlelit lounge, dunking cookies in milk like a little gang of rebels. They were a strange, impossible picture. The billionaire, the waitress, and the boy who had brought them together. Arthur watched his son laugh, a real, unrestrained giggle, as he got a milk mustache. He looked at Lena, who was laughing with him, her face radiant in the warm light. A profound feeling washed over him, a feeling so foreign he could barely name it. It felt like hope. It felt like home. He felt a powerful, undeniable pull towards her. It wasn't just gratitude. It was an attraction to her spirit, her resilience, her incredible capacity for grace. He was seeing her, really seeing her, for the first time. And she was magnificent. Just as the bond between them solidified into something tangible and real, the world decided to return. There was a low hum, and then the lamps in the lounge flickered to life, flooding the room with a harsh, artificial yellow light. The candles suddenly looked small and pathetic. The magic was over. Outside, the rain had subsided to a gentle drizzle, and the distant sound of traffic could be heard. The spell was broken. The other guests began to stand, stretching, gathering their things, their voices rising to a normal, impatient pitch. The club manager reappeared, his professional smile firmly back in place. "The roads are clearing, ladies and gentlemen. Your cars can be brought around now." Reality intruded. Arthur was once again Arthur Vance, the billionaire. Lena was once again the waitress. The invisible walls of class and circumstance began to reconstruct themselves around them. An awkwardness settled in. "Well," Lena said, standing and smoothing down her dress. "I should find my group." "Wait," Arthur said, standing too. He felt a sense of panic. He couldn't let her just disappear. "Lena, What was he going to say? "Thank you? Can I see you again?" The words felt clumsy, inadequate. Before he could find them, a crisp, condescending voice cut through the air. "Vance, there you are. I thought you might have washed away with the proletariat." It was Peterson, a senior board member of Arthur's company, a man whose ambition was matched only by his snobbery. He was immaculate in his tuxedo, not a hair out of place, as if the storm had been a minor inconvenience he had simply willed away. He strode towards them, his eyes sweeping over the scene, taking in Arthur, a sleeper-looking Leo, and Lena in her simple black uniform. Peterson's gaze lingered on Lena for a moment, a flicker of disdain in his eyes. He then turned to Arthur, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial murmur, but one that was perfectly audible to Lena. "Bit of a fiasco, this. Still, might have been worth it," he said with a smug smile. I managed to close the Henderson deal over by the bar. You, on the other hand, he smirked, gesturing vaguely towards Lena. Looks like you've been fraternizing with the help. Don't tell me this little power outage made you go soft, Arthur. The words landed like a slap. Fraternizing with the help. It was a test. A brutal, public test. Lena's breath caught in her chest. She looked at Arthur, her heart pounding. She saw him, in that split second, see her through Peterson's eyes. She saw the flash of panic, the old, familiar instinct to distance himself, to reassert his status. This was his moment. This was his choice. He could stand with her, the woman who had just shared his deepest grief, or he could stand with Peterson, the man who represented the cold, gilded cage he was supposedly trying to escape. Arthur faltered. The warmth that had filled him only moments before turned to ice in his veins. The weight of his world, of Peterson's judgment, of a decade of ingrained behavior, came crashing down on him. He was embarrassed. He was exposed. And he made the wrong choice. He didn't agree with Peterson, but he didn't fight him either. He put on his boardroom face, a mask of cool detachment. He took a subtle step away from Lena, creating a chasm of physical space between them. We were just waiting out the storm, Peterson, he said, his voice clipped and formal, all the previous warmth gone. My son was tired. The staff was kind enough to find us a place to sit. That's all. The staff. He hadn't even used her name. He had demoted her, in one swift, cowardly sentence, back to an anonymous, invisible role. For Lena, the betrayal was absolute. It was a dagger to the heart. The intimacy they had shared, the confessions, the laughter over cookies. He had just invalidated all of it to save face in front of this awful man. His shame wasn't just about his son. She realized with a sickening clarity. He was ashamed of her. Ashamed of being seen with her. Her face, which had been so open and warm, closed down. The light in her eyes went out. She looked at him, and in her gaze, he saw the full extent of his betrayal. He saw the beautiful, fragile thing they had built together shatter into a million pieces. She didn't cry. She wouldn't give him or Peterson the satisfaction. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet and brittle. I guess the storm is over, she said, looking directly at Arthur. Enjoy the rest of your evening, Mr. Vance. The Mr. Vance was the final twist of the knife. It was a deliberate return to the formality he had just established. With a final, heartbreaking look of disappointment, she turned and walked away, melting back into the group of staff gathering by the door. She didn't look back. Arthur stood frozen, the blood roaring in his ears. Peterson clapped him on the shoulder. Good man. For a second there, I thought you were going to invite her for breakfast. Can you imagine? He chuckled, oblivious. Arthur couldn't hear him. He was watching Lena's retreating back, a profound, gut-wrenching sense of loss washing over him. Leo, standing beside him, tugged on his hand. Daddy? He asked, his small voice full of confusion. Where is Lena going? Arthur looked down at his son. He had no answer. He had just been given a glimpse of a different life, a warmer world. And in a moment of cowardice, he had slammed the door shut, leaving himself, and his son, alone in the cold once more. The drive home was suffocating. The city, washed clean by the storm, glittered with a renewed, almost mocking brilliance. The familiar, expensive silence of the limousine had returned, but it was no longer a comfort. It was an accusation. Every reflection in the rain-slicked windows showed Arthur his own hollow-eyed expression. Beside him, Leo was unnaturally still. He hadn't spoken since asking where Lena was going. He just stared out the window, his small face a mask of disappointment. He wasn't just sad that Lena was gone. He was confused by the sudden, inexplicable shift in his father. He had felt the warmth, the possibility of something new, and had watched his father extinguish it with a few cold words. They arrived at the penthouse. The staff moved with their usual silent efficiency, but the opulent space felt cavernous and empty. The triple-paned glass that usually kept the world out now seemed to lock the loneliness in. Time for bed, Leo, Arthur said, his voice sounding rusty and unfamiliar to his own ears. Leo didn't move. He stood in the middle of the vast living room, clutching the MP3 player in his pocket. He looked up at his father, and for the first time, there wasn't just quiet obedience in his eyes. There was a challenge. "You were mean to her," Leo said. The 3 words were spoken softly, but they landed in the silent room with the force of a gavel. Arthur was taken aback. Leo rarely, if ever, confronted him. "It's complicated, Leo." "No," Leo insisted, his small jaw set with a stubbornness Arthur recognized as his own. "She was nice. You were mean. Ann Peterson was mean. You let him be mean." It was the unvarnished, brutal truth of a child. He had seen everything, and he had understood everything. He hadn't been fooled by the formal words or the subtle shifts in posture. He had felt the betrayal on a primal level. Leo then did something that shattered Arthur's composure completely. He held out his right hand, the small, capable hand that had wiggled to the music, and he performed the simple, shuffling dance step. The one he had taught Lena. He did it once, then looked at his father, his expression a heartbreaking mixture of defiance and pleading. "Dance," Leo said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. A desperate plea to bring back the feeling, the connection, the brief, beautiful moment when his father had almost been the man he was supposed to be. Arthur stared at his son, at the clumsy, hopeful movement of his feet, and something inside him finally broke. The walls of pride, of shame, of fear, they didn't just crack, they crumbled into dust. He saw the scene for what it was, his son, begging him to choose joy over fear, connection over status. He was begging him to choose Lena. All the excuses, all the rationalizations, evaporated. He hadn't been protecting his reputation. He had been protecting his cowardice. He had sacrificed a moment of pure, authentic connection on the altar of a man's opinion he didn't even respect. He had let Peterson's toxic worldview infect him, and in doing so, he had hurt the 2 people who had offered him a lifeline. His son, and the woman who had reminded him how to see his son. He knelt, just as Lena had, bringing himself to Leo's level. The gesture felt foreign, humbling. "You're right," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was mean. I was a coward. And I am so sorry, Leo." Leo's defiant expression softened, his lower lip trembling. He just nodded, the silent tears he'd been holding back finally spilling over. Arthur didn't hesitate. He pulled his son into his arms, a real hug, fierce and protective and full of a decade of unexpressed love. He held Leo tight, the boy's small frame shaking with quiet sobs, and Arthur felt his own eyes burn. He wasn't managing a project anymore. He was holding his son. He stayed there on the floor, holding Leo, until the crying subsided. The choice was no longer a choice. It was a necessity. It wasn't just about his own chance at happiness anymore. It was about Leo's. His son deserved a world with people like Lena in it. He deserved a father who was brave enough to let them in. He knew what he had to do, but it couldn't be a grand, empty gesture. He couldn't send a car or a check or an assistant. That was the old Arthur's way. The new Arthur, the one Leo was demanding he become, had to show up. He had to be vulnerable. He had to risk everything, not with his money, but with his heart. He looked at the clock. It was late, but not impossibly so. He had heard her mention the Liberty Diner. He knew her name. It was enough. He stood up, his resolve hardening into a clear, sharp point. "Come on," he said to Leo, his voice full of a new, unfamiliar energy. "We're going out." Leo looked up, his face tear-stained but hopeful. "Way. We're going to fix what I broke," Arthur said. "And I'm going to need your help." The Liberty Diner was quiet at 10:30 the next morning. The breakfast rush was over, the lunch crowd not yet arrived. It was a peaceful lull, the air smelling of coffee and old vinyl. Lena moved with a tired grace, wiping down counters, refilling sugar shakers. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Arthur's face as he dismissed her, the way he had stepped away, creating that physical and emotional chasm. The hurt had settled into a dull, heavy ache in her chest. The bell over the diner door jingled, and Lena looked up, a professional smile ready. The smile froze on her face. Standing in the doorway were Arthur and Leo Vance. They were not the figures from the gala. There were no tuxedos, no polished shoes. Arthur was wearing a simple pair of dark jeans and a grey Henley shirt that looked rumpled, as if he'd slept in it. He looked exhausted, nervous, and profoundly out of place. Leo stood beside him, clutching his hand, wearing a brightly colored t-shirt with a superhero on it. They looked like a father and son, not an empire and its heir. Lena's first instinct was to retreat, to put up the wall of cool professionalism that had been her shield for years. Her heart began to pound a defensive rhythm. What did he want? To apologize with money? To offer her a job to assuage his guilt? Oh, the cook peered through the service window. Well, look what the cat dragged in, he muttered, eyeing Arthur's expensive watch. You need a menu, pal. Arthur ignored him. His eyes were only on Lena. He took a tentative step inside, Leo moving with him. He didn't speak right away. He just stood there, letting her see him, letting the silence be filled with his vulnerability. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet, stripped of all its former arrogance. Lena. She just stared at him, her arms crossed over her chest, her expression unreadable. I don't have an excuse, he began, his voice faltering slightly. What I did last night was inexcusable. It was cowardly, and it was cruel. I was so afraid of what Peterson would think, of what my world would think, that I betrayed the first moment of real light I've felt in a decade. I betrayed you, and I betrayed my son. He looked down at Leo. We talked last night. He showed me who I was, and I didn't like the man I saw. Lena's expression remained guarded. Apologies were easy. Words were cheap. She had heard them before. Arthur seemed to understand this. He knew he couldn't just talk his way out of the chasm he had created. He had to take an action. He had to meet her in her world, on her terms. He looked around the small, humble diner, at the worn-down linoleum floors, the cracked red vinyl of the booths, the smell of frying bacon. This was her space. A place of warmth and authenticity he had never known. Then, in a gesture that echoed their first meeting, he did something that stunned her into silence. He let go of Leo's hand and looked at his son. Okay, Leo, he said softly. Show me. Leo, his face serious with the importance of his mission, looked at his father. Then he looked at Lena. He took his small, shuffling step. A simple weight shift. A sway. And then Arthur Vance, the billionaire, the titan of industry, the man who commanded boardrooms and built empires, tried to copy him. His movements were stiff, awkward, hopelessly clumsy. He was a man completely disconnected from his own body, a man who had lived his entire life in his head. He shuffled his feet on the greasy linoleum, his expensive shoes looking absurd. He looked foolish. He knew he looked foolish. And he didn't care. He looked at Lena, his face a mask of raw, desperate sincerity. I don't know how, he said, his voice cracking with emotion. It was a confession of so much more than dancing. I don't know how to do any of this. The joy, the connection, the love. I've forgotten. Please, he begged, his pride completely gone. Could you show me? He had taken her words from the gala, could you show me a step, and offered them back to her, a plea for redemption. It was the echo that shattered her defenses. It was the sight of this powerful, broken man making himself small and ridiculous in the middle of her diner, not for show, but for real. It was the look on Leo's face, a mixture of pride and hope, as he watched his father try. The tears she had refused to cry last night welled in her eyes. The heavy ache in her chest dissolved, replaced by a wave of something overwhelming and beautiful. She uncrossed her arms. She walked around the counter until she was standing in front of them. She looked at Arthur, at this man who had traveled all the way from his world to hers, not to conquer it, but to ask for entry. She smiled. A real, brilliant smile, the first one he had seen since the storm. Okay, she said softly, but you're doing it all wrong. She tapped his foot with hers. It's more of a sway. You have to feel the music, even when there isn't any. Like this. And there, in the quiet of the Liberty Diner, with all the cook watching in stunned silence from the grill, Lena started to dance. She mirrored Leo's step, and then she looked at Arthur, her eyes inviting him in. Hesitantly, he joined them. The three of them, a strange and wonderful trio, shuffled and swayed on the linoleum floor. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't polished. It was clumsy and awkward and real. It was a new beginning. It was a promise. It was the beautiful, unexpected, and triumphant dance of love at last. The story doesn't end here, of course. It was just getting started, filled with cooker-dunking lessons, clumsy dance steps in the park, and the slow, steady building of a new kind of family, one built not on a foundation of wealth, but of warmth, acceptance, and the courage to be vulnerable. 6 months later, the first thing Arthur Vance learned about his new life was that it was loud. Not the chaotic noise of a city or the polite hum of a gala, but the glorious, unpredictable noise of living. It was the sound of Leo giggling as he slid, much too fast, down the bright yellow slide at the public park. It was the sound of Lena singing, slightly off-key but full of heart, as she packed a picnic basket in the penthouse kitchen. A space that was no longer a sterile laboratory but a room that smelled perpetually of cinnamon and coffee. On a sun-drenched Saturday afternoon, Arthur sat on a park bench, watching them. He was wearing a pair of jeans that Lena had insisted he buy, ones that were actually comfortable and not designer-distressed. He felt a phantom urge to check his phone for stock alerts or emails, but his phone was in the car. Lena's rule. The park is a no-phone zone. It's a full-contact sport. Leo, whose limp had noticeably improved with a new, less rigid therapy regimen Lena had helped research, scrambled up the rope ladder to the wooden castle. His movements were more confident, his laughter more frequent. The quiet, solemn boy from the gala was gone, replaced by a vibrant, happy child who wasn't afraid to take up space in the world. "Dad, watch!" Leo shouted from the top of the slide. "I'm watching, champ." Arthur called back, his voice full of a warmth that was now second nature. He waved, a big, goofy wave he never would have used 6 months ago. Lena plopped down on the bench beside him, handing him a slightly squashed sandwich wrapped in wax paper. "Tuna salad. Ul's secret recipe," she said with a grin. "Don't ask what's in it. Just enjoy the mystery." Arthur took a bite. It was the best thing he'd ever tasted. He looked at Lena, her face tilted up to the sun, a genuine, unforced serenity in her expression. He was still learning her language, the language of simple joy, of finding beauty in the imperfect. He'd recently tried to plan a perfectly optimized weekend trip to a 5-star resort, complete with a minute-by-minute itinerary. Lena had gently vetoed it, and instead, they'd spent a Saturday at the local science museum, ending the day with pizza from a hole-in-the-wall place she loved. It had been the best trip of his life. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, nudging him with her shoulder. "I was just thinking," he said, watching Leo successfully navigate the monkey bars, "that I spent 10 years trying to build a soundproof world for him. I thought silence meant peace." He shook his head, a small, wondrous smile on his face. "I was so wrong. This is what peace sounds like." The sound of his son's laughter, the rustle of leaves, the soft murmur of Lena's voice beside him. He wouldn't trade it for all the silent penthouses in the world. He was still a billionaire. He still ran an empire. But that was now his job, not his identity. His identity was here, on this worn-out park bench, eating a squashed tuna sandwich next to the woman he loved, watching their son conquer a plastic castle. A week later, they attended a fundraiser for the city library. It was a world Arthur knew well, but this time, he was navigating it differently. Lena was on his arm, not as a secret, but as his partner. She wore a simple, elegant blue dress that made her eyes sparkle. She was a little nervous, but she held his hand tightly, her presence a steady, warm anchor. They were talking to a city councilwoman when the ghost of his past appeared. "Vance." The voice was as slick and unwelcome as an oil spill. It was Peterson. He glided towards them, a shark in a tuxedo, his eyes immediately flicking to Lena with undisguised contempt. "I see you're still enjoying your charity project," Peterson said. His voice a low sneer meant only for Arthur to hear, but loud enough for Lena to catch every poisonous syllable. 6 months ago, those words would have sent a jolt of panic through Arthur. He would have felt the pull of his old world, the shame, the need to placate. But now, he felt nothing but a calm, clarifying certainty. He didn't drop Lena's hand. Instead, he tightened his grip and turned to face Peterson fully, pulling Lena slightly forward, proudly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His tone was quiet, level, and absolutely immovable. "Peterson," he said, looking the man directly in the eye. "This is Lena, the woman I love. She is my partner, and the co-pilot of my life." He paused, letting the words sink in. "She's the best thing that has ever happened to me and to my son. Frankly, she's taught me more about what's valuable than any market trend or board meeting ever has. The only project I'm concerned with these days is trying to be a man who is worthy of her and our family." He smiled, a genuine, confident smile that held no fear. "Now, if you'll excuse us, the councilwoman was just telling us about a new children's literacy program. It sounds fascinating." He gave Peterson a final, dismissive nod and turned his back on him completely, giving his full, undivided attention back to the councilwoman. He had not only defended Lena, he had celebrated her. He hadn't just shut Peterson down, he had rendered him and his entire worldview irrelevant. Lena looked up at him, her eyes shining with love and pride. It wasn't just that he had stood up for her, it was the ease with which he had done it. The change in him wasn't a performance. It was a deep, seismic shift in the bedrock of his soul. In that moment, any lingering shadow of doubt she might have harbored about his transformation vanished forever. She squeezed his hand, a silent, powerful message of "I love you" that he felt all the way to his core. That night, after they'd tucked a happy, sleepy Leo into bed, Arthur and Lena stood on the penthouse balcony. The city sprawled before them, a breathtaking tapestry of light. It was the same view Arthur had once stared at with a sense of lonely ownership. Now, it was just a beautiful backdrop to the only view that mattered, the woman standing next to him. The penthouse itself was different. Leo's brightly colored paintings were stuck to the vast, stainless steel refrigerator. A half-finished puzzle was spread across a low table, and Lena's copy of a well-worn novel lay face down on the arm of the sofa. It was a home now, filled with the beautiful, messy clutter of a life being lived. "You were amazing tonight," Lena said softly, leaning her head on his shoulder. "What you said to Peterson." "It was the easiest thing I've ever said, because it's the truest," he replied, wrapping his arms around her. "There wasn't a choice to make, Lena. My world isn't with men like him anymore. My world is right here." He turned to face her, taking both of her hands in his. His heart, which had been so calm and steady in the face of Peterson's attack, was now hammering in his chest. "I've been thinking about what you said at the diner that first day," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "That I had to learn to feel the music, even when there isn't any. For so long, my life was silent. And then you and Leo, you brought the music back. You are the music." He took a deep breath, his eyes locked on hers. "I don't want to just fix what I broke. That's not enough. I want to build a new life, from the ground up, with you. A life filled with laughter and off-key singing and terrible tuna sandwiches." A tear slid down his cheek, but this time, it was one of pure, unadulterated joy. A life where we dance in diners and on balconies and in our kitchen for the next 50 years. He dropped to one knee, a gesture that felt both profoundly momentous and perfectly natural. "Lena," he said, his voice shaking with the force of his love. "Will you marry me? Will you and Leo officially let me into your family and make us whole?" Lena was crying, silent, happy tears streaming down her face. She didn't even let him finish before she was nodding, laughing through the tears. "Yes," she whispered, pulling him to his feet. "Oh, yes. 1,000 times, yes." He stood and pulled her into a deep, loving kiss. The city lights blurred into 1,000 shimmering stars behind them. It was a kiss that held the memory of a rainy night, the taste of chocolate chip cookies, the sound of a child's laughter, and the promise of a lifetime of dances, both clumsy and graceful. They had found each other in the most unexpected of ways. A billionaire who had to learn how to feel and a waitress who had never forgotten how. And they knew, with absolute certainty, that the best music, the truest love, was a song you built together, one simple, joyful, shuffling step at a time. We often think that grand gestures are what change our lives, but sometimes it's the smallest acts that hold the most power. A kind word, a shared cookie, a simple dance step. What small moment has had the biggest impact on your life? I would be truly honored to read your stories in the comments below. Thank you for sharing this journey with us today. We'll see you next time.